They called her a rogue until she saved the Alphas family and changed everything.
Blood stained the fresh snow, a stark crimson against the blinding white of Snoqualmie Pass. Genevieve Lawson hadn't asked for this war. Exiled, branded a murderer, and stripped of her pack, she had one rule: stay hidden. But looking at the overturned SUV, walking away wasn't an option. Genevieve wiped the grease-stained counter of Smitty's diner for the fourth time that hour, her movements mechanical, her mind miles away. Outside the frosted windows, the sky above North Bend, Washington, was a bruising shade of purple, heavy with the promise of a brutal winter storm. It had been 3 years since she was stripped of her title, her family, and her pack. 3 years of living in the grueling, bone-deep cold that came with a severed pack bond. At 24, Genevieve looked entirely different from the vibrant, high-ranking lead tracker she had once been for the Silver Pine Pack. Her golden brown hair was chopped haphazardly at her shoulders, her skin pale from lack of sunlight and proper nutrition. Underneath her faded flannel and heavily patched Carhartt jacket, her body was a map of scars, souvenirs from a life lived on the fringes, constantly defending her small, unclaimed territory from other desperate rogues. She wasn't a rogue by choice. The memory still burned like acid in the back of her throat. Richard Sterling, the former alpha of Silver Pine, had stood before the council and presented damning, fabricated evidence. A bloody silver blade found beneath her floorboards, and offshore bank accounts in her name, tying her to the hunters who had ambushed and killed Vivienne, the pack's beloved Luna. Genevieve had discovered Richard's own embezzlement and his sick, treasonous deals with the hunting factions, but before she could bring the evidence to light, he had struck first. But the deepest wound hadn't come from Richard. It had come from his son, Dominic. Dominic, the man she was supposed to mate. Dominic, who had looked at the evidence, looked at her, and let the ice settle in his eyes. He had assumed the alpha title that very night and handed down her sentence: exile. "Evie, honey, you're wearing a hole in the formica," Brenda, the diner's human owner, said gently, snapping Genevieve back to the present. "Shift's over. Get on home before the pass closes. The radio says we're getting 3 feet by morning." Genevieve offered a tight, practiced smile. "Thanks, Brenda. See you on Tuesday." Pushing through the diner doors, the freezing wind hit her like a physical blow. Her inner wolf, normally a source of warmth and comfort, whimpered in the back of her mind, weakened by the isolation. She climbed into her rusting 1998 Ford Ranger, the engine sputtering and whining before finally kicking into a begrudging idle. As she navigated the treacherous, winding roads of Route 202, the snow began to fall in thick, blinding sheets. She lived in a dilapidated hunting cabin just 5 miles from the Silver Pine border. It was a dangerous game, staying this close to the territory of wolves who would tear her apart on sight, but her wolf had stubbornly refused to leave the region. It was tied to the land and, pathetically, tied to Dominic. About 3 miles from her turnoff, her heightened senses picked up something that made the hair on her arms stand on end. Over the smell of freezing rain, pine needles, and her truck's exhaust came the distinct, sharp tang of ozone, silver, and beneath it, the hot, metallic scent of fresh blood, familiar blood. Genevieve slammed on the brakes, the Ranger fishtailing wildly before coming to a halt on the icy shoulder. She killed the engine and stepped out into the howling blizzard. Her amber eyes, flashing to their wolfish hue, scanned the dense tree line. Down a steep, jagged embankment, barely visible through the swirling snow, was the crushed chassis of a black Cadillac Escalade. It had smashed violently against a massive Douglas fir. Genevieve didn't think. Instinct, raw and undeniably protective, took over. She scrambled down the treacherous slope, her boots slipping on ice and loose rock. As she neared the wreck, the scent hit her with the force of a freight train. Pine and cedar, sterling blood. She reached the shattered driver's side window. The driver, a human security guard she vaguely recognized from her pack days, was dead, his neck snapped by the impact. But in the back seat, coughing weakly through the deploying airbags and smoke, were 2 figures: Abigail Sterling, Dominic's 19-year-old sister, and clutched fiercely in Abigail's arms was Leo, Dominic's 5-year-old son. Genevieve's heart hammered against her ribs. She wrenched the mangled back door open with a surge of supernatural strength, the metal groaning in protest. "Abigail!" Genevieve rasped, her voice rough from disuse. The young woman blinked, blood pouring from a nasty gash on her forehead. When her eyes focused on Genevieve, raw terror eclipsed her pain. "You, the rogue, Genevieve." "No, please, don't hurt him." "I'm not going to hurt you," Genevieve snapped, her senses suddenly flaring. The wind shifted. They weren't alone. "We have to move. Now." She examined the vehicle's tires. They hadn't just slid off the road. The thick, all-terrain rubber was shredded, eaten away by caltrops laced with silver nitrate. This was an ambush. Someone had intentionally run the Alphas family off the road, and the hunters were coming to finish the job. 3 dark figures materialized at the top of the embankment. The wind whipped their dark tactical gear, but the scent rolling off them was unmistakable. Mercenaries. Humans heavily armed with silver-laced weaponry, paid to do the dirty work of cowards. "Get the boy out," Genevieve ordered Abigail, her voice dropping an octave, taking on the resonant, commanding timbre of a lead wolf. "Crawl out the other side. Hide behind the roots of that fallen cedar." "My leg," Abigail sobbed, clutching her shin. The bone wasn't exposed, but the unnatural angle spoke of a severe fracture. "I can't walk," Genevieve cursed under her breath. She reached in, unbuckling the weeping 5-year-old. Leo was terrified, his small hands grasping at Genevieve's jacket. He had Dominic's exact shade of storm-gray eyes. For a fraction of a second, staring into the child's face, the years of bitter resentment melted away. "Hold on to me, little cub," Genevieve whispered, tucking the boy into the heavy folds of her Carhartt coat. A sharp crack echoed through the canyon. A bullet tore through the snow, grazing Genevieve's shoulder. The burning agony of silver nitrate flared instantly, sizzling against her flesh and sending a shockwave of nausea through her system. She hissed, biting her lips so hard she tasted copper, and shoved Leo into Abigail's arms. "Stay down," she commanded. Genevieve didn't have time to strip. She let the shift take her violently, the agonizing snap and reform of bones ripping through her clothes, where a scarred woman had stood a second before. A massive, timber wolf now crouched in the snow. Her coat was a mottled mix of gold and ash, thinner than it should be, but her muscles were coiled like steel springs. The mercenaries scrambled down the slope, drawing specialized machetes and leveling their rifles. They expected a starved, weak rogue. They didn't expect the former deadliest tracker of the Silver Pine Pack. Genevieve lunged. She hit the first man with the force of a battering ram, her jaws snapping shut around his wrist before he could fire. The sickening crunch of bone was lost to the howling wind. The man screamed, dropping his rifle. She tossed him aside and pivoted, barely dodging a silver blade swung by the second attacker. The blade caught her flank, slicing deep. Pain, blinding and toxic, flooded her veins, but she pushed it down into a dark, primal corner of her mind. She tackled the second man, using her weight to pin him in the deep snow, rendering him unconscious with a brutal strike of her heavy paws. The third mercenary panicked. He aimed his rifle not at Genevieve, but at the overturned SUV where Abigail and Leo were hiding. Genevieve let out a deafening, blood-curdling roar. She vaulted over the hood of the wrecked Cadillac, taking the bullet midair. It buried itself deep into her thigh, bursting with a sickening flare of silver heat. She crashed into the snow, rolling violently, but momentum carried her forward. Her jaws clamped onto the third man's leg, dragging him down into the freezing mud until he stopped moving. Silence, save for the wailing blizzard, fell over the ravine. Genevieve shifted back to her human form, collapsing onto the frozen earth. She was naked, shivering violently, and bleeding black, poisoned blood from 2 severe silver wounds. She dragged herself toward the trunk of the SUV, pulling out a heavy emergency blanket and throwing it over her trembling shoulders. "Genevieve?" Abigail's voice was a terrified whisper. Genevieve crawled over to them. She was losing strength rapidly, the silver migrating through her bloodstream. "We can't stay here," she rasped, her teeth chattering so hard they ached. "More will come. I have to get you to the border." "You can't cross the border," Abigail protested, clutching Leo tightly. "Dominic's orders. The enforcers will execute you on sight." "Better me than you," Genevieve grunted. Using a piece of jagged metal from the car's undercarriage, Genevieve frantically cut down several thick pine boughs, lashing them together with the torn seatbelts from the wreckage. It was a crude, makeshift sled. It took every ounce of her remaining strength to lift Abigail onto it, settling Leo securely against his aunt's chest. Then began the march into hell. Genevieve tied the pulling strap around her own waist. The snow was up to her knees. The wind fought her with every step, a solid wall of freezing air pushing her back. The silver in her thigh made her right leg nearly useless. She was effectively dragging it, leaving a thick, dark trail of blood in the pristine snow. 1 mile, then 2. Genevieve lost track of time. Her vision tunneled, the edges bleeding into static darkness. Her inner wolf was silent now, curled into a tight ball, focusing entirely on keeping her heart beating. She operated on sheer, stubborn will, driven by the soft, frightened whimpers of Dominic's child behind her. Finally, the tree line shifted. The massive, ancient redwoods, marked with the deep, clawed runes of the silver pine pack, came into view. The border. Genevieve crossed the invisible line, the magical warding of the territory sending a sharp electrical shock through her system, alerting the pack's sentries. She only managed to drag the sled another 50 yards before her body completely gave out. Her knees buckled, and she pitched forward into the snow, the world spinning out of control. Within minutes, the thunder of heavy paws echoed through the woods. 4 massive wolves burst into the clearing, shifting immediately into their human forms. Enforcers. "Hands where I can see them, rogue!" one shouted, leveling a weapon at her. "Stop, don't shoot her!" Abigail screamed from the sled, her voice raw. "She saved us! Put the guns down!" The enforcers hesitated, confusion washing over their faces as they realized who was on the sled. But the heavy, suffocating aura of an alpha suddenly blanketed the clearing, forcing the enforcers to drop to their knees. Dominic Sterling stepped out of the tree line. He was taller, broader than Genevieve remembered. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead by the snow, and his stormy gray eyes were wild with panic until they landed on the scene before him. He saw his sister, broken but alive. He saw his son, crying but safe. And then he looked down at the blood-soaked, emaciated woman lying face down in the snow. "Genevieve," Dominic breathed, the name torn from his throat. The Alpha command evaporated, replaced by profound, devastating shock. Genevieve tried to push herself up, her muscles screaming, the silver poison turning her veins a stark, bruised purple against her pale skin. She managed to lift her head just enough to meet his gaze. The man who had broken her heart, the man who had thrown her to the wolves. Your family is safe, Alpha," she whispered, the title laced with a bitter, exhausted mockery. "Now, do what you have to do." Her eyes rolled back, and Genevieve Lawson finally let the darkness take her. The rhythmic, agonizing beeping of a heart monitor was the first thing to breach the heavy veil of Genevieve's unconsciousness. Then came the smell. It wasn't the familiar, comforting scent of damp earth and pine needles, but the sharp, sterile sting of bleach, iodine, and rubbing alcohol. She dragged her heavy eyelids open, the harsh fluorescent lights blinding her for a moment. As her vision cleared, the beige walls of the Silver Pine Pack's private medical facility came into focus. Panic, sharp and immediate, flared in her chest. She tried to sit up, but a dull, throbbing agony radiating from her shoulder and right thigh pinned her to the mattress. Her limbs felt like they were cast in lead. "Don't move, Genevieve. The silver nitrate was deep in your muscle tissue. Dr. Bennett had to perform a surgical extraction." The voice came from the corner of the room, thick with exhaustion and an emotion Genevieve hadn't heard directed at her in 3 years. Remorse. Dominic Sterling sat in a vinyl visitor's chair. He looked as though he had aged a decade in the span of a few days. His usually immaculate jawline was shadowed with dark stubble, his clothes were rumpled, and the storm-gray eyes that met hers were bloodshot and haunted. Genevieve didn't soften. She forced her breathing to steady, locking her jaw. "Where are Abigail and Leo?" she rasped, her throat dry as sandpaper. "Safe," Dominic said, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Abigail's leg is pinned. She's recovering in the ward down the hall. Leo doesn't have a scratch on him. Because of you." "Good," Genevieve said flatly. She stared at the IV dripping fluids into her arm. "Then my debt to your bloodline is paid. Tell Bennett to stitch me up so I can leave. I know the laws of exile. I don't want an execution squad dragging me out of this bed." Dominic flinched as if she had struck him. He stood up, pacing to the end of her bed, his large hands gripping the plastic footboard until his knuckles turned white. "There will be no execution, Genevieve," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "And there is no exile. Not anymore." Genevieve let out a harsh, humorless laugh that ended in a painful cough. "Did the Alpha suddenly grow a conscience? Or did seeing me bleed for your son simply make you feel guilty for a day?" "I deserve your anger," Dominic said, refusing to look away from her piercing amber gaze. "I deserve everything you want to throw at me. But it's not just guilt, Genevieve. It's the truth. Abigail didn't just survive that crash. She brought something with her. Something she found while clearing out the attic of my father's old estate." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, heavy silver hard drive. He placed it on the tray table next to her bed. "My father didn't just embezzle PAC funds to cover up his incompetence," Dominic explained, the disgust in his tone palpable. "He was drowning in debt. Millions of dollars lost in offshore shell companies and illegal gambling syndicates run by a human cartel operating out of Seattle. When he couldn't pay, he made a deal with a private military corporation called Blackwood Security. They wanted the mineral and logging rights to the Snoqualmie territory. My father agreed to lease PAC lands to them illegally." Genevieve frowned, the pieces slowly clicking together in her fogged mind. "Vivienne," she whispered. Dominic's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. "My mother found out. She was going to expose him to the regional council. So my father hired Blackwood to stage a hunter ambush. He had his own mate murdered." The room grew suffocatingly silent. Genevieve felt a cold chill wash over her, effectively freezing the anger and leaving behind a hollow, sickening horror. "When you started looking into the missing treasury funds as lead tracker, you got too close," Dominic continued, his voice cracking. "He needed a scapegoat. He planted the silver blade. He forged the offshore accounts in your name. I was grieving my mother, Genevieve. I was blind with rage, and I trusted my alpha. I trusted my father. I didn't look at the evidence with a clear mind. I just looked for someone to blame." "You looked at me," Genevieve said, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. "And you saw a murderer. We grew up together, Dominic. I fought by your side. We were." She couldn't bring herself to say the word mates. "And you threw me to the snow without a second glance." "It is the greatest failure of my life," Dominic confessed, stepping closer to the bed, though he dared not touch her. "The mercenaries who ran Abigail off the road, they were Blackwood. My father is dead, but his debts didn't die with him. They came to take Leo as collateral to force me to sign over the land rights. If you hadn't been there on that road—" Dominic stopped, unable to finish the sentence. He bowed his head, the proud alpha looking entirely broken. Genevieve stared at the ceiling. The vindication she had craved for 3 years tasted like ash in her mouth. Real life wasn't a fairy tale. Knowing she was innocent didn't magically erase the 3 winters she had spent starving, freezing, and fighting off feral rogues for scraps of food. It didn't heal the trauma of being violently severed from her community. "What do you want from me, Dominic?" she asked, her voice devoid of emotion. "I want to make it right," he pleaded softly. "I want you to come home. I want to reinstate your rank, with full back pay and reparations, and I need your help. Blackwood is still out there. They failed to take my son, which means they will strike again. Their compound is hidden somewhere in the Cascades. I have my enforcers, but I don't have a tracker who knows the high-altitude terrain like you do. I need the best." Genevieve closed her eyes. Her body screamed for rest, but her mind was already shifting into a tactical gear it hadn't used in years. She thought of Leo's terrified, tear-streaked face. She thought of Abigail's shattered leg. Blackwood Security was a heavily armed corporate militia masquerading as a security firm. They wouldn't stop. They were humans leveraging modern warfare against the PAC's traditions. She opened her eyes, fixing Dominic with a stare as hard as flint. "I will find them for you," Genevieve said. "I will track them, and I will help you tear Blackwood to the ground so they never threaten that little boy again. But understand this, Dominic. I am doing it for Leo. I am doing it for Abigail. And I am doing it to put the ghosts of my past to rest." "Genevieve, do not mistake my cooperation for forgiveness," she interrupted, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "You broke our bond 3 years ago. You don't get to glue it back together just because you realized you were wrong. Bring me topographical maps of the Snoqualmie Ridge and a satellite phone. We have work to do." 2 weeks later, the physical wounds had scarred over into pale, jagged lines across Genevieve's thigh and shoulder, but the psychological exhaustion lingered. She crouched on a rain-slicked granite outcropping, peering through a thermal monocular. The relentless Pacific Northwest rain battered her tactical gear. Beside her lay Dominic and 6 of Silver Pine's elite enforcers. They weren't fighting like traditional wolves tonight. They were executing a tactical strike. 300 yards north, Genevieve whispered into her comms piece. 4 guards. The main compound is an abandoned Weyerhaeuser logging mill. They're using the old timber silos to block satellite surveillance. Stealth approach, Dominic commanded softly. Non-lethal force on the perimeter guards if possible, but salute the command center. We need the physical ledgers and the operational commander, Jonathan Croft. They moved like shadows through the torrential rain. Genevieve took the lead, her senses hyper-tuned, picking out tripwires with lethal grace. For the first time in years, she felt a dark sense of purpose. They breached the eastern drainage pipe. The takedown of the perimeter was silent and brutal, the enforcers utilizing chokeholds and tranquilizers. Dominic kicked open the heavy steel door to the main mill office. Inside, heavily armed men scrambled, but the silver pine wolves shifted in the confined space, an explosion of fur, muscle, and terrifying speed. Genevieve, her injuries making full transformation too risky, moved through the fray with electrified tactical batons, disarming 2 mercenaries. Within 4 minutes, the room was secure. At the back of the office sat Jonathan Croft, a ruthless man with an arrogant sneer that faltered only slightly as Dominic, still in his massive wolf form, stalked toward him. Genevieve stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Dominic's shoulder. He stopped and shifted fluidly back to his human form, pulling on tactical pants thrown by an enforcer. "Jonathan Croft," Genevieve said, slamming her baton onto a stack of hard drives. "Your contract with Richard Sterling is null and void." Croft sneered, leaning back in his leather chair. "You think breaking my jaw or destroying this camp changes anything? Sterling owed us $50 million. We have legally binding contracts. The moment you leave, I make one phone call, and the state troopers will be crawling all over your precious reserve. You can't fight modern corporate law with claws, sweetheart." "You're right," Genevieve said flatly, pulling a heavy, leather-bound ledger from his open safe. "Which is why I didn't rely on claws. 2 hours ago, while you were sleeping, I bypassed your encrypted firewall. I sent the entire history of your illegal land seizures, blackmail, and weapons smuggling to an old contact of mine, a senior litigator at Davis Wright Tremaine in Seattle." Croft's arrogant smile instantly vanished. Davis Wright Tremaine was a real, formidable legal powerhouse, not a myth, not a pack legend, but a terrifying reality in the corporate world. "They specialize in corporate fraud," Genevieve continued, her amber eyes flashing. "They've already handed the files over to the FBI's Seattle field office. Your accounts are frozen. The feds are raiding your corporate headquarters as we speak. You have no money, no leverage, and no company." She looked at Dominic. "We have what we need. Let's go home." The trial at the Regional Pack Council was swift. With the evidence procured, Richard Sterling's legacy was publicly burned to ash. His name was struck from the Pack's history, and the treasury debts were absolved. Genevieve stood in the center of the Grand Pack Hall. The high, vaulted ceilings of the Silver Pine estate echoed with the murmurs of hundreds of wolves looking at her with profound shame. Dominic stood at the podium, wearing a formal, dark suit. "For 3 years, this pack failed its brightest and bravest." Dominic's voice boomed across the silent hall. "We allowed manipulation to blind us. Genevieve Lawson was stripped of her honor, yet when our darkest hour came, she bled for the very people who cast her out. By the power vested in me as Alpha, I formally reinstate Genevieve Lawson to the Silver Pine Pack. I offer her the position of lead tracker, an independent seat on the council, and full control over our border security." The pack erupted into a deafening cheer. Dominic held up a hand, silencing them, and stepped down until he was inches from her. "And," he whispered, so only she could hear, "I am asking you to stay, with me, as my mate. Let me spend the rest of my life proving I am worthy of the woman who saved my family." Genevieve looked at the man she had once loved. She saw genuine desperation to make amends. But real life was not about sudden, magical epiphanies. It was about hard work. The trauma of freezing nights and gnawing hunger didn't just vanish with an apology. She reached out and took his hand in a firm handshake. "I accept the position of lead tracker Alpha," Genevieve said steadily, offering a small, sad smile. "I will take the office on the 3rd floor, and I expect my back pay deposited by Friday." Dominic's face fell slightly. "And the rest?" "A mate bond isn't a bandage, Dominic. You can't just place it over a bullet hole and expect the bleeding to stop," she said softly. "Trust is a house built brick by brick. You demolished ours. I am willing to rebuild my life here, and if you want to help me lay the foundation, you can try. But you have to earn me back, every single day." Dominic squeezed her hand, a profound respect settling over his stormy eyes. He didn't demand. He simply nodded. Brick by brick, he agreed. I'll start tomorrow. Genevieve turned toward the crowd. She had walked through the fire of betrayal and forged her own salvation. As she spotted little Leo waving at her excitedly from Abigail's lap, Genevieve knew one thing for certain. She was finally home, strictly on her own terms. True redemption is rarely found in grand romantic gestures. It is earned through accountability and time. Genevieve's journey from a wrongfully exiled rogue to a sovereign leader underscores that survival requires immense resilience, while forgiveness demands rigorous boundaries. The pack survived not by magic, but by facing the grounded reality of their failures. In the end, trust, like a shattered bone, takes painstaking patience to heal and rebuild.
Hi, my name is King's Obsession Concord, the owner and manager of King's Obsession Concord. After watching the video, they called her a rogue, until she saved the Alphas family and changed everything. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the way the story challenged assumptions. It's easy for people to place labels on someone and decide who they are without knowing their heart or their intentions. What made this story emotional for me was seeing someone who had been judged and pushed aside prove her worth through courage, loyalty, and selfless actions when it mattered most. Do you think people are too quick to judge those who seem different or don't fit in? And if you were part of the Alphas family, would you have trusted her before she proved herself? Stories like this remind me that character is often revealed through actions, not reputation, and that sometimes the people we overlook have the most to offer. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy emotional Alpha King stories filled with loyalty, redemption, and unexpected connections, feel free to like and subscribe for more whenever you'd like.